We read two stories by Mary Wilkins Freeman, one of which you might have read before, The Yellow Wallpaper, and another which I doubt you've read called Turned. And I want to talk about those two stories individually somewhat, but I also want to make a larger point about how literary scholars operate. You know, how as professionals, what do we do in preparation for analyzing and writing about, these texts? What's the process that we go through? And the first thing that we do, if I'm going to write about a story by Catherine Ann Porter, let's say, we're going to read Catherine Ann Porter's Flowering Judas later in the semester. And I have written about Catherine Ann Porter. Well, what did I do first to prepare to write about Catherine Ann Porter? I read everything by Catherine Ann Porter. When I read about Flannery O'Connor, I read everything about Flannery O'Connor. When I read about William S. Burroughs, I read everything by William S. Burroughs. When I read about Edgar Allan Poe, on and on and on. Long list of writers that I've read every word of. Poe, for example, 18 volumes. Every word. And that's not just their short stories or novels or poems or whatever. It's also their letters. If they write reviews, for example, Edgar Allan Poe was a prolific reviewer. In fact, our first great American reviewer of literature. And letters and anything that they wrote. That's all primary material for the scholar. Next thing you want to do, or actually simultaneously while you're doing that, you want to read a good biography of the writer so that you can put their works in context, preferably a newer one. And then the last thing you do is look up what other people had to say about it. And they will say some really interesting things, and they may well say things that are a lot like what you thought, but probably you will have thought something that was at least a little bit different, and may be original enough to pursue for publication. But the first thing you do is you read everything by that writer. Why do you do that? Because when you read everything by a writer, the individual work by that writer takes on a different context. You have read their best work, you've read their worst work. You've read the same story by them. Flannery O'Connor, for example, writes the same story over and over and over again. We're going to read her story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. But the individual work can best be understood in the context of the writer's work as a whole. You can interpret the individual story through that whole, what the French would call oeuvre, O-E-U-V-R-E, or egg. So I gave you not one story by her, but two. And I think the editors who put it in the anthology might have chosen it for this reason. If you read the one story, then you read the second story helps you understand the first story. So I had you read a story that perhaps you've read before, The Yellow Wallpaper. And I asked you a very simple question, which, the answer to which you must have thought was a trick and couldn't be correct. I asked you, who was the woman in the yellow wallpaper? And, almost everybody who reads the story, and if you ask them that question, they'll say, well, it's that woman. She's projecting herself into the wallpaper. And in fact, that's a sensible answer. She's a writer. She's having she's had pen and paper taken away from her, although she was keeping a little secret journal, I think. What do artists do? When they can't express themselves in one medium, they find another medium. If they've had everything taken away from them, as this woman has, she starts writing stories in the only paper at hand, and that's the wallpaper. And she creates a story of an encaged, desperate woman fighting to get out of her reality, all right? Which clearly reflects her own position. So if I ask you who is the woman in the yellow wallpaper, well, it makes sense that you would say it's her. It's her. And I don't have a problem with that answer. However, if I gave you just one more story by Charlotte Perkins, by Mary Wilkins Freeman,
It's
Turned.
Oh, it's the different one. Okay.
Mary Wilkins Freeman, yeah. My wife's corrected me. If I give you just one more story, and that's Turned. Now, Turned is a completely different story than The Yellow Wallpaper.
The Yellow Wallpaper is Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. You were right. Yes, I said the wrong author. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Yes, I'm sorry. I got Freeman mixed up in my head. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. If I give you just one more story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Turn, and it's a very different story than The Yellow Wallpaper. It's about a woman who's a college professor, right? She's a professional. And she's married, Her husband has some powerful position, I assume. They have a maid, and they're living in a brownstone somewhere in a, an academic town like Boston or New York or somewhere. And the husband coerces the maid into having sex with him, and she gets pregnant, and the wife finds out about it. And of course, her response is first to be mad at the husband. I think she first gets mad at the husband, or maybe no. First, she gets mad at the maid. She thinks, this terrible young woman, how could she betray me like this? And then she thinks, no, I know what happened here. My husband has all the power in this family. He coerced her into doing this. And if you want to read it really, I think realistically, that young woman was raped by that man. That would be my guess. Certainly it was an abuse of power on his part. So she gets mad at the husband. She thinks, how could he do this to me? And she thinks, she feels victimized by him. And then she goes on thinking, she thinks, well, the maid's a victim here too. And then finally she comes to the conclusion that there's another victim here, and that's the unborn child. So she becomes less and less the victim, and she realizes, well, this maid was taken advantage of too, and this poor child is going to be born into a world, with everything against her. It turns out to be a little girl when the child is born. And then she thinks, no, there's another victim here. And it's very explicit in the story. She says when one woman has this happen to her, it's an offense against all women. So it's women as a whole who are being victimized by this. And it's not specific. She realizes it's not specific to her situation, that if this can happen to any of us, be taken advantage of like this, then it's not just an offense to this singular woman. It applies to all women who are all in this. It could happen to all of them and has happened to many of them in one form or another. So it's not one woman, it's all women. Then I asked you to go back after reading Turned and reconsider the question I asked you about the yellow wallpaper. Who's the woman in the yellow wallpaper? And if you go back and look at it and think about it, after having read Turned, you realize it's not just about that one woman. It's about all women. And if you look at the story closely and in detail, you'll see that there's not just one woman behind that wall, trapped in that wallpaper. There are several women. So it's not a singular woman. So I use those two stories not just on their own merits and to talk about the situation of women in the 19th century, early 20th century, but also to teach you something about how reading a lot of works, you don't have to read all of them, but reading a lot of works by a single writer helps you understand and teaches you how to interpret the individual work by that writer. Thank you.